everyone. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Julia Moluf. Julia is the residential manager for Best Buddies Living. Hi, Julia.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So I invited you on the show today to talk with us about Best Buddies, your organization, and their role in accessible housing. So perhaps we could start by telling our listeners what Best Buddies is and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Best Buddies is an international nonprofit organization. We are in all 50 states and over 50 countries around the world. We were founded in 1989 by Anthony Kennedy Shriver. So we've been around a little bit over 30 years. And we started out with a really simple concept, which was one-to-one friendships between people with and without intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that's probably what Best Buddies is most well known for, is our friendship programs. We have those from elementary school all the way through college and even after graduation. And then as we continue to grow, we had our leadership pillar, and that works on self-advocacy skills for people with IDD. And then we also have our jobs pillar, which helps adults with disabilities find paid and competitive employment opportunities. And then just 3 years ago is when we started Best Buddies Living. So in comparison to the entire organization, this living adventure is a little bit new to us, but we're really excited to be in the inclusive living space.
And how long have you been involved with the inclusive living thing since it started?
So I was a volunteer for Best Buddies all throughout my high school career and my college career, and then I joined as staff in August of 2020. So I've been on for about 2 years, and they had been working on Best Buddies Living for about a year before I joined.
So before we get into what Best Buddies Living entails, what it is, what was happening in the organization that fostered them to develop this new path?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the need was just continuing to grow. And I know we were just speaking about Denise Resnick, and she has published a really fabulous article about how great the housing need is for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And what we're finding is that because adults with IDD are living longer lives thanks to medical advancements, there's this new problem that's coming, which is that they're outliving their caregivers. And so these families and these parents are really faced with a cliff. When their son or daughter graduates high school, there's a lot of those supports that came with the schooling system kind of fall off the deep end. And so Best Buddies was addressing, so many of those problems within the school system. And we started to kind of work with more adults through the jobs program. But what we were seeing is that those adults in our jobs program and those who were graduating from our friendship programs didn't have a plan for where to live next or how to take that next step or gain some of those independent living skills. So it's become clear to us in this short amount of time that the need for these kinds of housing opportunities is just absolutely phenomenal.
Is there a relationship that you've noticed between the success of your clients, that is to say, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, in their employment and their life skills when they have their housing sorted out? Do you find that there's a relationship in their success associated with housing?
I mean, certainly from my perspective, I'm the full-time residential manager. So I live on site at Best Buddies Living and provide direct one-to-one supports in skills like grocery shopping and taking public transportation, living with roommates, cooking, cleaning, lots of cleaning. So, just in my day-to-day, I think our community at Best Buddies Living really sets our participants up for success. All of my residents work either full-time or part-time. So they all have something going on during the day. They have a purpose. They have somewhere where they're earning a paycheck. And then they get to come home to a community where other people are doing the exact same thing. We have group dinners and events. I just think similar to a college dorm, when you're surrounded by people who are studying and doing things on campus, I think you see more success than students who are maybe having to commute or things like that. So definitely anecdotally, I definitely have seen those successes, and we hope to bring some data out of it once we have more people.
That's great. So let's go back a bit. So tell me more about the model. So how does Best Buddies Living work, and where is it? How many states is it in, and all those sorts of things? let's look at it at a high level first.
Yeah, absolutely. So just like everything else in Best Buddies Living is an inclusive program. So we're providing housing opportunities for people with and without disabilities to live together. So that's what we believe really sets us apart from a lot of other housing programs or group homes. And I'm the first to say we need as many opportunities as possible. There's no competition. We want as many of these types of programs to open, but that's definitely something that sets us apart, is that we have people with and without disabilities living together.
So before you go on,
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but does Best Buddies develop the properties too, and working with the developer to build the housing environment, or are you layering on something that's already there that has some elements that would be housing for people with IDD?
It's a great question, and we've done both. So currently, right now, we have 3 locations. We have a location in Miami, Florida, where our headquarters is, and we have 2 locations here in Washington, D.C. Now, all 3 of those locations, we are simply subleasing from larger apartment buildings. So Best Buddies is subleasing a handful of units, both for the participants and the on-site residential manager, and we're just running our program in a larger apartment building. However, we have a really exciting development happening. It's aimed to open in summer of 2023 in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And that program is different because we have been working with a developer. They are building the building with Best Buddies Living in mind, and it's going to be entirely dedicated to Best Buddies Living. So I think as we're kind of growing and expanding, we're seeing different models maybe work in different markets, or what kind of opportunities we have there. But we're doing both, and we're exploring both options.
Wonderful. So before we get into this innovative new project, let's just talk about these 3 buildings. You guys are lessees of the landlord.
Mhm.
And then are your clients sub-lessees? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, they're practically sub lessees because they are subleasing from Best Buddies, and Best Buddies is subleasing from the building. So
And
go ahead. Sorry.
does Best Buddies play market rate for the rentals? And
we
then
do.
you sublease at a discount?
We sublease at market rate.
At market rate.
Yes.
Okay, so your clients who are getting into these housing units, who are self-identifying as disabled, are paying, they're not getting a subsidized rental at all. They're just getting an apartment that is going to be provide support for them with whatever disabling condition they have. And is it strictly DD and IDD, or does it include non-developmental disabilities?
Primarily, it has been people with IDD, so an intellectual or developmental disability. But that being said, we aren't turning anybody away based on that criteria. So we would certainly be open to talking to anybody who was interested, and maybe they would even take the spot of a quote unquote non-disabled resident if part of their disability wasn't that IDD, where they wouldn't need the same supports from a residential manager.
So in your 3 buildings where you're subleasing in a regular market environment,
Mhm.
does the building landlord set restrictions on how many units you can lease, or where they are in the building, or anything like that?
So the first building that we started this model in, we had a board of directors member who owned the building. So that's kind of how we got into the building in the first place. So in my location specifically, we're all like in a corner of the hallway together. And that was because he knew the program and he knew what we were trying to accomplish. Whereas the other apartment buildings, we are very truthful and upfront about what we're doing, but it doesn't have to be a partnership with the building. So the way they see it is that we're just renting a couple of units, and we're going to use the common spaces and the amenities, pretty much the same way as any other resident would. And so thus far, we've really just kind of been operating as independent subleasers. And if the building wants to learn more and partner with us and do trainings, that's great. But if not, we're able to kind of self-sustain.
Have you had when you've sought out these opportunities, have you met any resistance where landlords don't want to lease to you?
I would say, I don't know if resistance is the right word. I think we've had some hesitation about what exactly it would entail for the landlord, which is kind of where we reassure them that it wouldn't be any different than leasing to anybody else, and allowing us to sublet. So I would say, any hesitation is pretty quickly pretty quickly mulled over when we're able to just kind of explain to them that there's no additional risk to them. They're really not taking on any responsibilities. And if anything, they're inviting diversity into their building that likely wasn't there before.
Do you find that you have enough folks who can afford to pay market rents that are interested in these units?
So I would say yes, just because the housing need is so great that even at market rate, we're finding families of people with disabilities who are interested and are looking for those housing opportunities. However, as we're starting to expand, we've begun with a scholarship application. So we're really doing our best to think of ways and be forward thinking about how we can make this program accessible to people, not just with disabilities, but also in different socioeconomic brackets. So that's something that we've started. And we hope to, as we continue to expand, that we can do things like work with buildings and maybe, not be at market rate. But all of this is just such a test point for Best Buddies, and we're just proving that the model works. And as we expand, we hope to make it accessible to as many people as we can.
Wonderful. How many residents do you have in the 3 buildings that are already in play?
So at my location at the Union Market Building in DC, I have 6 residents, 4 with disabilities and 2 without. The Georgetown location has been a pilot program this past year, so there were just 2 residents there, but we're expanding to 6 this summer. And the Miami location has 4 residents currently, but they're also expanding to 6 early this fall.
And do these folks live like by themselves in these units with support from the residential manager, or do they have in-home support, people who come into the home and are there to help them with things?
So primarily, and the residents we have right now, they all are living independently. So coming into this program, they already have relatively low support needs. So some of those basic independent living skills are already in place. We're also not a licensed facility, so we're not able to do any medication management or anything like that. So there's certainly a baseline of independence that has to be there. Now, that being said, we haven't had this yet, but we're certainly open to people bringing in their own support. So for instance, I had an applicant who, for other reasons, it didn't work out for them, but they were going to bring in someone who would cook all of their meals for them because of their physical disability. So that would have been absolutely fine and, definitely reasonable and wouldn't have, interrupted the community in any way. So we're definitely open to people bringing in their own supports if they need more than what the residential manager role is able to provide.
Oh, I have, some of my listeners may not know this, but I have a developmental disability. I have cerebral palsy, and
Okay.
I've lived pretty independently my whole life.
Sure.
And I have the means to pay market rent for an apartment should I wish to.
Sure.
Why would I want to come apply to live in one of your apartments instead of just getting an apartment somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And the answer is that it's a community. When people are joining Best Buddies Living, both with and without disabilities, they're signing up to be a part of a community. So we do group dinners together every Wednesday, which have kind of become the bread and butter of Best Buddies Living. Just catching up with one another, really forming genuine friendships. It's a pretty small group, right? These locations have 6, between 4 and 6 people, maybe 8 at the most. So you really get the opportunity to get to know one another and kind of form that community. And then we do events throughout the month, all sorts of fun things. Here in DC, we're doing a Nationals game. We're doing a screen on the green. We're going to music trivia next week. So there's this built-in community that you wouldn't get if you just moved into an apartment building, by yourself. And also Best Buddies, as I mentioned, has been around for so many years. So there's also other events that Best Buddies in the area is putting on that we go to as a group. So I really just think that it provides a sense of community. And I'll often get people asking me, how do you quote unquote incentivize people without disabilities to live here? And the answer is that we don't. We're looking for people who see the value in living in a diverse community. We don't offer it a discount rent. We don't want them to be caregivers for their roommates. We just want someone who understands that living in a diverse community has a lot of value, and they want to go to group dinners. They want to participate in those events. So as someone who is part of the community, I can definitely attest to it is quite the place to be.
And do people live there with families, or is it strictly single people?
So far, we've had single people, and a lot of that reason is just based on the apartments that we're renting from. There's just not really a feasibility to have more than one person in each unit.
So apart from organizing this amazing Wednesday night dinner, what is your role? Tell us a little bit more about how you make a difference for these folks in these rentals.
Planning the group dinners, planning the events, that is the fun and the easy part of the role. But a lot of my time is spent on one-on-one supports for those adults with disabilities and things like cooking and cleaning, grocery shopping, even just living with roommates, learning how to communicate with roommates, taking public transportation. I also work a lot with the families of residents with disabilities on their support plan, what their goals are. What are those independent living skills that they're missing? We see ourselves as being a transition program. So maybe somebody stays here for a year, maybe someone stays here for 3 years, but we picture this to be a stepping stone for people who maybe are close to being able to live independently, but are still missing some of those skills. And we hope that we can, help them, hone in on those skills during their time at Best Buddies Living.
Wonderful. So let's circle back. Tell me about this new project you're doing.
In Hyannis?
Yes.
Yes. So this project is definitely groundbreaking for Best Buddies. It's a much larger scale than what we're doing currently. So this project in Hyannis is going to have space.
That's in, where's Hyannis?
Sorry, it's in Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Okay.
Yeah, the town is Hyannis, but it's going to have space for 24 residents. Again, it'll be a mix of people with and without disabilities. And unlike renting from a large apartment building, these two buildings will be completely dedicated to Best Buddies Living. So we're going to have more staffing. There's going to be obviously more events. There's going to be more group dinners. It's going to be everything we're doing, just on a bigger scale. We've been working with families from Cape Cod who, just like everywhere else, are looking for that next step for their son or daughter. There's also a huge need for housing on the Cape, particularly for residents without disabilities. There's a hospital nearby. So we're really hoping to hone in on what is a bit of a housing crisis there, and also meeting the need for providing housing to these adults with disabilities that are looking for that next step. So we're very excited to be, bringing this on such a bigger scale.
Wonderful. Do you see Best Buddies Living going into other states in the future and getting bigger?
Yeah, I really do. I think, like I said, we definitely know the need is there. I mean, I spend, at least a couple hours a week speaking to families who are interested in Best Buddies Living, but don't want to lose their waiver in their state, or can't move to DC or Miami. And so they're just desperate to bring a program like Best Buddies Living to where they are. So we definitely know the need is there, and Best Buddies has such a strong presence, in states all across the country. So I definitely think we're going to be expanding, in these next years.
So Julia, what do you love most about your role?
Oh, that's a good question. It's hard for me to answer. There's so many things that I love about this role. It's definitely challenging, but it's one of the most rewarding roles that I've ever been in. I think what I love most about this role is when inclusion is happening without my guidance. So, I plan these group dinners, I plan events, but how I know that I'm doing my job well and that the community is really thriving is when my residents with and without disabilities are hanging out on their own. They're going to dinner together, they're spending time together, they're making plans, they're checking in on one another. They're doing what you would do with anybody else. And it's proving that, Best Buddies Living works, and that inclusion really doesn't have boundaries. You don't necessarily need someone to say, hey, let's be friends, let's include everybody. If you give people the space to be inclusive and to have an inclusive environment, that inclusion does come. So I think that's probably one of my favorite parts is seeing those moments where it's happening all on its own.
And there must be moments, like in any job, where you're ready to pull your hair out. Can you tell us what's challenging about what you're trying to do?
Yeah, there definitely are moments. I recommend this to anybody in this kind of work. I have a folder on my desktop called My Why. And every time I get like a nice email or like some positive feedback from a family or a resident, I put it in that folder and I read through those on my hard days. This role is challenging. in a few different ways. I mean, one of them is just the nature of the role. I'm here 24/7. So, working from home or living where you work is kind of two different ways to think about it. So there's definitely the work-life balance in a role like this can be challenging.
Yeah.
I also just think what can be challenging as someone who identifies, as an advocate for the disability community is that there's just not enough you can do. I want to accept everybody into the program. I want to have space for everybody. I want to expand as quick as we can. And the reality is that it's going to take time, and it's going to take convincing people, and it's going to take getting people on board with what we're doing. And I think it can be frustrating at times that we're not able to be the solution for everyone. But I think that's why, working with people like Denise from First Place, I mean, there are lots of programs like this popping up, and there's power in numbers, and just making sure that if I'm not able to help someone, I can refer them to someone else. Because I think, everyone deserves a chance to live independently and to have that next step. So sometimes it just doesn't move fast enough for me.
I know there are listeners of my show from all of the states, and some of whom are very dedicated to creating new solutions in their communities for inclusive living. What advice would you give to someone who might be listening to this from a nonprofit developer or a service provider who is trying to figure this out? What would you say that they should focus on as they start down the road of developing more housing, perhaps in the manner that your agency did?
Oh, gosh, I mean, it's such a good question. And, I'll be the first to say that, Best Buddies had a leg up. We had 30 years of nonprofit experience. People recognized our name. People know the Kennedy family. We had these benefits with us going into it. And I know, and I actually say this to a lot of people in this field, that gave us a leg up that not everybody has, so I think it can be really tough for smaller nonprofits who are trying to get their toes wet in this inclusive housing community. But I think my only advice would be to meet your community where it's at. If it's possible for you to get on the waiver system and be able to open some housing that qualifies for low income housing waivers in your community, and that's the best route to go, I would go that way. If you're in a wealthier community and you have people who can afford private pay, start there. I think you kind of have to meet your community where it's at. It's not going to be a one size fits all solution for everyone. But if you start somewhere and you make it successful, hopefully you can increase your population, and you can add more people down the line. But you have to start somewhere. And that would be my best piece of advice.
I love the enthusiasm in your voice. It's just absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
So what got you into this? Like, how did you say you've been volunteering with Best Buddies for a long time? How did you come to know the organization and to get more involved with it?
Yeah, it's pretty cliche. I was a freshman in high school, and I was at like our club fair, and I had just moved to the area, and they said that this club was about making friends. And I thought that sounded promising for someone who didn't know anybody and was at a new school. And I joined Best Buddies, and I was matched with my buddy Haley, who's been one of my best friends now for going on 10 years, who has cerebral palsy and is in a wheelchair. And she just changed my perspective on just about everything in life. And she just became one of my closest friends. And I knew that if it wasn't for Best Buddies, I wouldn't have seen her on campus. I wouldn't have been introduced to her. This special education classroom was behind locked doors, and had it not for Best Buddies, we wouldn't have become friends. So it really started out there, and I just did a lot as a student leader and participated in different, roles, and did the same thing throughout college, and was lucky enough to join a staff when I graduated.
So you mentioned that your friend changed your perspective. Can you share a little bit more with my listeners about how your worldview changed as a result of your friendship with, what was her name?
Haley.
With Haley. How your whole perspective changed. What's the lessons that she's taught you?
Gosh, it just feels endless. I as I've grown, and I do my best as someone who does not identify as someone with a disability to really listen to the disability community. And I do my best to stray away from inspiration porn or infantilizing people with disabilities. So I say this very genuinely when, she just changed my perspective. Some things that were so easy for me, and things that I wasn't thinking twice about, brushing my teeth and eating breakfast, and being in a mainstream classroom and applying to college. These were things that she either had to work 10 times as hard at or was not getting the opportunities to do. And spending time with her family and just listening to the ways that they had to navigate the school system, and how her mom had to just be a constant advocate for the most basic things for her daughter's success, was just something that always stuck with me. And as I've continued to be friends with her, I've continued to watch the challenges she faces that I just won't ever face. And it just puts things in perspective for me, and it makes me want to create as many opportunities for people like Haley, and for her friends and the people she spends time with, because they deserve, all the things that everyone else does.
That's great. And I think it's really well put. I think that one of the great things about programs like the Best Buddies program is it broadens our worldview, and we could do with more of that in general in our
Absolutely.
world. So if I have listeners who want to learn more about Best Buddies or about Best Buddies Living, and learn more about this model, how should they find out more?
Yeah, I mean, bestbuddies.org/living is the best way to learn about our living program. You can reach out through that page, through an info form. I'm the one who answers the info form, so you'd be reaching out to me directly. So that's certainly a way. We also have a big presence on social media. All of our handles are just at Best Buddies. So that's really a great way to kind of get your toes wet. We have lots of big events, like the Friendship Walk was just this past weekend in DC, which is just with thousands of people who are, learning more or have been in it for 10 years. So there's lots of ways to get involved.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Julia, for spending some time with me today talking about this. I think it's wonderful to, as I said, to hear your enthusiasm and to learn about this program. And I hope it can grow a lot bigger. So instead of talking about housing for, several dozen people, instead we can be talking in a year or 5 about housing for hundreds and thousands of people that is accessible and safe and secure. So
no, thank you so much for what you're doing. Bringing awareness to this is so huge. So I'm really appreciative for you having me on, and I hope we'll have to do a yearly check-in and see
that'd be great.
where we're at next.
That'd be great. Thank you.